I'll never forget that day. It was the most exciting moment of my life. It was supposed to be one of those quiet, uneventful days where you just drift through the routine, not thinking much about anything. The sun was creeping through the curtains, filling the apartment with a warm glow as I lounged on the couch, flipping through random TV channels. But, as usual, life loves to throw you off guard when you least expect it. I suddenly heard a weird gurgling sound from the bathroom, followed by a loud splash that made me sit up straight. My stomach tightened as I realized what was happening. The pipes were acting up again, and I knew better than to ignore it. I'd tried fixing them myself once, thinking a quick YouTube tutorial would do the trick, but all it did was make things worse. With a sigh, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the local plumber's number. I'd hired him once before. We hadn't talked much, but I remembered him as being professional and quick. Still, there was something about letting someone else into my space that made me feel uneasy. An hour later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find him standing there, toolbox in hand, looking as rugged as I remembered. He was in his early 30s, maybe a couple of years older than me, with a thick beard, sharp features, and arms that strained against the fabric of his work shirt. His muscular build gave off the impression that he was more than capable of handling any problem that came his way. "Hey, I'm here for the busted pipe," he said, flashing me a polite smile as he stepped inside. "Yeah, it's in the bathroom," I replied, motioning for him to follow me. He didn't waste any time, heading straight into the bathroom to assess the damage. I watched him from the doorway as he crouched down, inspecting the mess under the sink. His movements were efficient, practiced, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I should have been thinking about how grateful I was that he was fixing the problem, but instead, I found my thoughts drifting. There was something about the way his shirt clung to his back as he worked, the way his muscles flexed with each movement that made it hard to focus on anything else. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. "He's just the plumber," I told myself, feeling a bit ridiculous for even thinking about him in that way. But there was something about the quiet confidence in his movements, the way he carried himself, that made my heart beat a little faster. After a few minutes, he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "All set," he said, turning to face me. "Replaced the pipe, tightened everything up, shouldn't give you any more trouble." "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound casual even though my pulse had quickened just from the sight of him standing so close. "I appreciate it." His eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I could have sworn there was something in his gaze, something unspoken. He cleared his throat and glanced around the small bathroom, as if searching for something else to comment on. "You sure there's nothing else you need help with?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was an undercurrent to his words that sent a shiver down my spine. For a second, I didn't know how to respond. Was it just my imagination, or was there something more behind his question? My heart raced as I tried to think of something to say, but the longer the silence stretched between us, the more I realized that I didn't want to let him leave just yet. "Well, actually, I started feeling a flush creep up my neck. There might be something else." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze locking onto mine as he took a step closer. "What's that?" I swallowed hard, my nerves getting the better of me as I struggled to put my thoughts into words. "It's hard to explain," I stammered, feeling my cheeks heat up under his steady gaze. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile as he took another step toward me, closing the gap between us. "You can try." I stood frozen in place, the air between us charged with tension. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of which I could articulate. There was no denying the pull I felt toward him, no denying the way my heart hammered in my chest as he watched me, waiting for me to say something. And before I knew what I was doing, the words slipped out. "I've been thinking about you," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Ever since you walked in, I haven't been able to stop." His smile deepened, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down. He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming in the small bathroom. My breath caught in my throat as I realized how close we were standing, how easily I could reach out and touch him if I wanted to. "Is that right?" he murmured, his voice low and rough like he was testing the waters. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. I didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to tell him that the simple act of him being here had stirred something in me that I hadn't expected. All I knew was that I couldn't stop thinking about him, and I didn't want to. For a moment neither of us moved, the air was thick with unspoken tension, and I could feel the heat building between us like a storm ready to break. And then, just as I thought the moment would pass, he reached out and gently cupped my face in his hand. His touch was warm, firm, but gentle, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as his thumb brushed lightly against my cheek. I didn't know what to do, didn't know if I should pull away or lean into his touch, but before I could decide, he closed the distance between us and pressed his lips to mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative like we were both testing the waters, but as soon as our lips met, the hesitation melted away, replaced by a fierce, undeniable need. His hands roamed over my body, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, and I felt a rush of heat flood through me. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Every touch, every kiss sent sparks shooting through my body, and I couldn't get enough. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving just the two of us, lost in the intensity of the moment. The intensity between us grew with every passing second. His hands, rough from years of hard work, moved over me with a gentleness that made my breath hitch. I felt the firm pressure of his lips against mine, sending a surge of heat through my veins. The sound of the water dripping from the recently repaired pipe was the only thing that grounded me in the moment, reminding me where we were and what was happening, but even that seemed distant as we lost ourselves in the heat of the moment. I pulled him closer, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, feeling the firm muscles of his chest underneath. He responded with a low growl, his hands gripping my waist as if he couldn't bear to let me go. The kiss deepened, and for a moment I forgot everything else, forgot the world outside, forgot the boundaries we were crossing. Just as quickly as the moment began, reality came crashing back. He pulled away first, his breath heavy, his eyes searching mine as if he was trying to make sense of what had just happened. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with the realization of what we'd just done. I started, but the words died in my throat. What could I even say? That I hadn't expected this? That I didn't know what had come over me? His gaze softened, the earlier intensity giving way to something more uncertain, more vulnerable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, his hand still resting gently on my waist. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I'm fine, just surprised, I guess." He chuckled softly, the sound easing some of the tension in the air. "You and me both." For a long moment neither of us said anything. We stood there close enough to feel the warmth radiating from each other's bodies, but both unsure of what to do next. I could feel the weight of the unspoken question hanging between us. What now? I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "I didn't expect this," I admitted, my voice shaky. "But I don't regret it." His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite name, relief, maybe, or understanding. He stepped back slightly, giving me some space but keeping his hand on my arm. "Neither do I." The simplicity of his words hit me hard. It wasn't some grand confession or a declaration of undying feelings. It was just honesty, pure, raw, and simple. And somehow that made it even more real. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the small bathroom as if he was trying to figure out what to do next. "I should probably finish up and head out," he said, though there was hesitation in his voice, like he wasn't sure if he actually wanted to leave. I nodded, but the idea of him leaving made something in my chest tighten. I didn't want this to end yet, didn't want him to walk out the door and leave me alone with the memory of what had just happened. But I also didn't know how to ask him to stay, didn't know if it was even fair to ask that of him. "You don't have to rush," I said, my voice a little too casual. I mean, if you're not busy. He raised an eyebrow, his lips quirking into a small smile. You asking me to stick around? I felt a flush creep up my neck. I just thought we could hang out for a bit, maybe grab a drink or something. He chuckled again, this time a little louder. You're pretty smooth, you know that? I shrugged, trying to play it cool even though my heart was racing. Just trying to be a good host. He grinned, his eyes sparkling with amusement. Well, in that case, I guess I can stick around for a bit. We left the bathroom, the tension between us easing slightly as we stepped back into the living room. I grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge, handing him one as we sat down on the couch. For a moment, everything felt almost normal, like we were just two people hanging out, enjoying a quiet afternoon. But there was no denying the undercurrent of tension that still lingered, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just happened between us. He took a long sip of his beer, leaning back against the couch as he glanced around the apartment. Nice place, he said, his voice casual. Thanks, I replied, though my mind was still spinning. It's small, but it works. We made small talk for a while, chatting about nothing in particular. Work, the weather, the usual things people talk about when they're trying to avoid saying what they're really thinking. But the more we talked, the more comfortable I felt. The earlier tension had melted away, replaced by an easy rapport that surprised me. It was like we'd known each other longer than just a couple of encounters, like there was something natural about the way we connected, and yet beneath the surface there was still that simmering heat. Every time our eyes met, every time our fingers brushed against each other, I felt it. The pull, the desire that hadn't gone away, no matter how much we tried to act like nothing had happened. Eventually the conversation lulled, and we both fell into a comfortable silence, sipping our beers and staring out the window as the late afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky. You ever think about what just happened? I asked, breaking the silence. He turned to look at me, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot. I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or nervous, and... He set his beer down on the table, leaning forward slightly as he rested his elbows on his knees. I think we both know there's something between us. My heart skipped a beat. Hearing him say it out loud made it feel more real, more tangible. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak. I'm not saying I know what this is, he continued, his voice steady but cautious. But I do know that I don't want to pretend like it didn't happen. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Neither do I. He smiled, the tension between us shifting into something more certain, more grounded. So, where do we go from here? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. I didn't have all the answers, I barely had any. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want this to end. Not yet. I guess we figure it out, I said, my voice soft but certain. He nodded, leaning back against the couch, his gaze never leaving mine. I'm good with that. The sun had started to set, casting a warm, golden glow through the windows. The world outside felt far away, distant, like it didn't matter anymore. In that moment, it was just the two of us, sitting in the quiet of my apartment, the unspoken promise of something more hanging in the air. As the evening settled in, the warm glow from the setting sun made everything feel softer, quieter, like the world outside had melted away, leaving just the two of us. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us in a hurry to break the comfortable quiet. But the weight of what had happened between us hung in the air, undeniable, and eventually, the unspoken thoughts started to bubble up. The plumber, Luke, as I'd learned from our casual conversation earlier, shifted slightly on the couch, his knee brushing against mine. The light touch sent a spark through me, a reminder of the tension that still simmered beneath the surface. He glanced at me, his gaze soft but serious, as if he was weighing his words carefully before speaking. I don't usually do this, he said after a moment, his voice quiet but steady. Get involved with clients. I nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't think you did. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. I'm not saying I regret it because I don't, but it's just... I wasn't expecting this. Neither was I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I'm not sorry it happened. Luke's gaze softened and he gave me a small smile. Me either. The silence between us stretched on, but this time it felt different, heavier, more loaded with meaning. I could feel the pull between us, the same electricity that had been there since the moment he walked into my apartment. It was undeniable, and now that we'd acknowledged it, it was impossible to ignore. He shifted closer to me, his knee pressing more firmly against mine as he leaned forward slightly. "What are we doing?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I didn't have an answer for him, not one that made sense, anyway. All I knew was that there was something between us, something that I couldn't explain but didn't want to let go of. I searched his face, looking for a sign that he felt the same confusion, the same pull, and when his gaze met mine, I knew he did. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart racing. "But I don't want it to stop." His eyes darkened, and for a moment I thought he might pull back, might tell me that we should leave things where they were, but instead he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my hand. The touch was soft, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through me, and I found myself leaning into him, closing the small distance between us. "I don't either," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Before I could say anything else, his hand cupped the back of my neck, pulling me closer until our lips met again. This time, the kiss was different, less hesitant, more sure, like we had both made a decision, and now there was no turning back. The heat between us flared, intense and consuming, and I felt myself getting lost in the moment, in the feeling of his hands on my skin and his lips on mine. We stumbled back onto the couch, our bodies pressed close together as the kiss deepened. My heart raced in my chest, and I couldn't get enough of him, the taste of him, the feel of his body against mine. Every touch sent a thrill through me, and I knew in that moment that I was completely and utterly hooked. Luke's hands roamed over my back, pulling me closer as his lips moved down to my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I tangled my fingers in his hair, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he kissed a trail along my jawline. The intensity between us was overwhelming, but I didn't want it to stop. I didn't want him to stop. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, Luke pulled back, his breathing heavy as he stared down at me. His eyes were filled with a mix of desire and hesitation, and I could see the struggle playing out on his face. He wanted this as much as I did, but there was something holding him back. "Wait," he whispered, his voice rough. "We need to slow down." I blinked, my mind still spinning from the intensity of the moment. "Why?" He exhaled slowly, his hands still resting on my shoulders as he looked at me. "Because I don't want this to just be a one-time thing." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been so caught up in the heat of the moment that I hadn't even considered what might happen after. But now that he'd said it, I realized I didn't want this to be a one-time thing either. "I don't either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke's eyes softened and he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead before pulling back slightly. "Then let's not rush. Let's take our time." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. He was right. We didn't need to rush this. Whatever was happening between us was too important, too real to rush through without thinking. I didn't want to ruin it by moving too fast. We sat there for a moment, catching our breath as the intensity of the moment slowly ebbed away. But even though we'd pulled back, the connection between us still burned, and I knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of quiet conversation and stolen glances. We talked about everything and nothing, laughing at the little things and sharing stories about our lives. It was easy, natural, like we had known each other for longer than just a few encounters. But beneath the surface, the tension still simmered, waiting for the right moment to resurface. When Luke finally stood to leave, I felt a pang of disappointment. I didn't want him to go, didn't want the night to end. But I knew that we were taking things slow, that we were building something more than just a fleeting moment. He lingered by the door, his hand resting on the handle as he turned to look at me one last time. "I'll see you again soon, right?" I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Definitely." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good. I'll call you." With that, he opened the door and stepped out into the night, leaving me standing in the quiet of my apartment, my heart still racing from the intensity of the evening. I leaned against the door, my mind spinning as I replayed the events of the night over and over in my head. It wasn't just the physical connection that had me reeling. It was the way we'd connected on a deeper level, the way we'd both acknowledged that this wasn't just a one-time thing. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful, like maybe, just maybe, I had found something real, something worth holding on to. But the story didn't end there. The best part was yet to come. The days that followed were filled with an unusual mix of anticipation and nervousness. I couldn't stop thinking about Luke, about everything that had happened between us, about what might happen next. He had said he would call, and though I knew it hadn't been long, I found myself checking my phone more often than usual, waiting for his name to pop up on the screen. When the call finally came, it was late in the afternoon, just as the golden light of the setting sun was filling my apartment. I glanced at the screen, my heart leaping when I saw his name, and quickly answered. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual even though my pulse had quickened just at the sound of his voice. "Hey," he replied, his voice low and warm. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab a drink tonight. Nothing fancy, just, to hang out." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Yeah, I'd like that." "Great," he said, a hint of relief in his voice. "I'll pick you up around 7? Perfect." I hung up the phone, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. I knew that tonight wasn't just about drinks, it was about figuring out what was happening between us, about taking the next step in whatever this was. But despite the uncertainty, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I wanted to see where this would go, wanted to explore the connection we had. By the time 7 rolled around, I was more than ready. I had spent the better part of the afternoon trying to focus on anything but the anticipation that was building inside me. But now that the moment had arrived, I felt strangely at ease. When Luke knocked on the door, I opened it to find him standing there, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, looking effortlessly handsome. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Yeah," I replied, stepping outside and closing the door behind me. We headed to a small, cozy bar not far from my place, the kind of spot that wasn't too crowded but had enough atmosphere to feel alive. We found a booth in the corner, away from the noise of the unordered drinks. As the evening unfolded, it became clear that whatever tension had lingered between us before was still there, but it had shifted into something different, something more comfortable and less urgent. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. He told me stories about his work, about growing up in the city, and I shared my own stories, how I'd ended up in this apartment, the small challenges of life that we all go through. It was easy, natural, like we had known each other for longer than we really had. But as the evening wore on, the conversation began to shift, and the weight of what had happened between us started to creep back into the space between us. "So," Luke said, taking a sip of his drink before setting it down, his gaze steady on mine. "We haven't really talked about the other night." I felt my heart skip a beat, but I nodded. "Yeah, we haven't. I'm not trying to rush things," he continued, his voice soft but serious. I've been thinking about it a lot. About us." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "Me too." There was a pause, the air between us thick with unspoken thoughts. I could feel the intensity of his gaze, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. This was it, the moment where we decided what came next. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken that night in my apartment. I think there's something here, something worth exploring." His words hung in the air, and I felt a surge of emotion rise inside me. I had been thinking the same thing, that whatever was happening between us was too important, too real to just walk away from. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel more concrete, more possible. I agree, I said, my voice steady but soft. I don't want this to be a one-time thing, either. Luke's expression softened and he reached across the table, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The simple touch sent a thrill through me, and I couldn't help but smile. So, what do we do now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled softly, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. I guess we take it one step at a time. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. We didn't have to have all the answers right now, we didn't have to know exactly where this was going. All we had to do was take it one day at a time, figure things out as we went along. We spent the rest of the night talking and laughing, the tension between us easing into something more comfortable, more certain. And when the bar finally started to close, we walked back to my place, the cool night air wrapping around us as we strolled through the quiet street. When we reached my door, Luke hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and the door. I should probably go, he said, though there was a hint of reluctance in his voice. I bit my lip, not wanting the night to end just yet. You don't have to. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought he might pull away. But then he smiled, his hand slipping into mine as he stepped closer. Okay, he whispered. We headed inside, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around us as I closed the door behind us. For a moment we just stood there, the weight of the night hanging between us. But then Luke reached out, pulling me close, and I felt the warmth of his body against mine, the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. The kiss came naturally, soft and slow at first, but it quickly deepened, the familiar heat building between us once again. It was just like before, intense, consuming, but this time there was something more, something deeper. It wasn't just about the physical connection anymore, it was about the bond we had begun to build, the trust and understanding that had grown between us. We stumbled toward the couch, our bodies pressed together as the kiss deepened. My hands roamed over his back, feeling the firm muscles beneath his shirt, and I felt a thrill of excitement rush through me. But this time, there was no urgency, no rush to get lost in the heat of the moment. We were taking our time, savoring every touch, every kiss. Luke's hands slid under my shirt, his fingers warm against my skin, and I shivered at the sensation. His touch was gentle, careful, like he was afraid of pushing too far too fast. But I didn't want him to hold back. I wanted him to know that this was okay, that I was ready for whatever came next. I pulled away from the kiss just long enough to look into his eyes, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. It's okay, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I want this. Luke's eyes darkened, and he nodded, his hands tightening on my waist as he pulled me closer. Me too, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. We went on for hours and hours, and as true love arises, that happened right there. If you found this story insightful, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel for more stories. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on future content.